Hey everyone, this is Sean Paulseth. Welcome back to a second episode of WedgeChatter. Today we are going to have a specific focus on nonprofit hiring, and we have two very special guests. Today we have Jack Friend, who is the leader of talent, but also HR at Goodwill, Ohio, specific to Akron. And Heidi Barnett, a very close partner of ours here at Wedge. She is Chief Revenue Officer at ApplicantPro. That has a multiple of services in kind of the recruitment space. Hey, Heidi. Hey, Jack.
Hey, good morning.
Hey, nice to see you, Sean.
You know what? And I was just saying today we're super excited to have both Heidi and Jack on our second episode of WedgeChatter. We're having a specific focus on nonprofit hiring, kind of the challenges that surround it, and what we can do to kind of overcome it. Obviously, it being kind of a unique industry. Now, would it be okay just to do a very brief intro on your end, Heidi, and then Jack? Just to kick it off?
Sure.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I'm Heidi Barnett. I work for ApplicantPro. I'm our Chief Revenue Officer here at ApplicantPro. I've actually been in the hiring space for, coming up on 11 years, and it's changed quite a bit over those years. And I think we're in a really unique environment right now. My background is in marketing, and well, as I talk through some of this, you'll see that hiring is a lot like marketing. And so that is one of the things that I love to focus on. And I've got 4 kids, live in Utah, and just really love being outside.
Thanks, Heidi.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Good morning. My name is Jack Friend. I'm with Goodwill Industries of Akron. I have been in workforce development for about 20 years. It started out working with displaced workers, and over time, over the last 7 or 8 years, it's been working with initially businesses doing third-party recruiting, and now recruiting on behalf of Goodwill. Obviously, I live here in North Canton, Ohio, which probably none of you have heard of. It's about 20 minutes south of Akron.
Well, I've heard of Akron, and I'm from Canada, so I was really impressed I even knew that. But thank you for both those intros. Heidi, I think your marketing background is more relevant than ever in terms of this hiring landscape. And Jack, your extensive background in recruitment is great, just based on all the different perspectives you probably have and what you've seen in those different areas. Now, kind of the first area, and I know there's been a lot of buzz about doing more with less, and because recruiters are good recruiters are hard to come by. I think recruiters as a job posting is the highest ever it's ever been. So I really wanted to get kind of a perspective on how people can maximize their recruitment budget today, because resources there's maybe not as much, and I would say particularly in the nonprofit space, because it's not a big corporate, they don't have a lot of I would say resources in that department. But I wanted to get to, since obviously, Jack, you can kick that off of how to maximize, or how you're maximizing your recruitment budget today, and do that kind of quote unquote more with less, particularly in this tough hiring landscape.
Well, the first thing, there really is no budget.
There you go.
Yeah.
In a nonprofit setting. But, I will say this, it's like anything, and not to, toot ApplicantPro's horn, but I will say we've been using ApplicantPro for a lot of years. It's not super fancy. It doesn't cost a lot of money. I mean, I've priced other systems, and even with all due respect to LinkedIn and Monster and those things that may cost $10,000 to $15,000 a year, for my needs, I'm not going to. I mean, it's irrelevant for me. Right. I need something that's just functional and easy to use, and is cost effective for us. We do occasionally target and sponsor ads on Indeed as needed, but we have too many to do it across the organization for it to be cost effective. It's only where we have a particular issue where a lot of positions have opened up. But, and I say you really have to, manage your time well. And one of the things where Wedge has helped us is it cuts through. One of the things I find that's unique to a nonprofit is a lot of candidates, we're usually not cost competitive. in terms of salary with for-profit companies. And a lot of candidates are very reluctant to tell me the salary's not a fit, the hours aren't a fit, whatever that may be.
Right.
So having Wedge gives them an easy out. If they don't do the Wedge right away, which takes you 15 minutes from home, it tells me you really weren't interested. You just didn't want to tell me that. I mean, I've had people say to me, well, Mr. Friend, this is very awkward. And I said, well, there's nothing awkward. If it's not a fit for you, that's fine. I've had people apologize to me because the salary wasn't a fit. And it's like, so you get to the point, you say, hey, this is a business conversation, So I understand that. But you really have to manage your time well. And you have to use technology where it helps you, but not be obsessed by it. You don't need all the bells and whistles. And you have to be open-minded. Hey, if someone walks in our store and fills out an application on paper, hey, I'll upload it into ApplicantPro. And I mean, you have to be open and doing whatever you can.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I loved what you said there about not needing all the bells and whistles, because, in the marketing space, a lot of times it's like, well, how big's your marketing stack? What is it that you guys are using? And a lot of times I think if you have too many tools, it can be distracting. So figuring out what those tools are that can really drive the result is what makes a huge difference. Because if not, then you're constantly learning and changing and spending all this time on tools that aren't driving your result.
Absolutely. And I will add to that, because we were reluctantly going to shift away. And again, not just tooting ApplicantPros, but we were going to shift away to a different ATS because we were going to a new payroll system. And unfortunately, one of the things I found out was the ATS with that payroll system was really hard to read. It wasn't very functional. It looked like it was developed by a payroll company. And luckily we did not move forward with that, but I'll be fully honest. I mean, simple is always better, I mean, a lot of people will focus on reaching out to people, cold calling on LinkedIn, but it's like selling life insurance, I mean, I've had very little success with that, even with professional jobs, just cold calling people on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
For sure. And I would say, because the market is definitely saturated in terms of all the bells and whistles and shiny kind of objects out there in terms of HR technology, trying to figure out the one that's the most simple and the best fit for you does take time, but there definitely are cost-effective ways to do so. And I'm glad, Jack, that you have found one that's a good fit there. I think to double click on your thing with time and recruiters' time, their number one currency is ultimately time. Who to spend time with, who to not spend time with. And spending time with too many of the wrong candidates can lead to things like burnout. And I know there's been a lot on kind of ways and strategies to mitigate that. And I think technology is definitely a place and an area that can help with recruiter burnout. But I wanted to get both your perspectives on kind of the issues that we hear about recruiters, obviously being they're the front runners of the company. They're the gatekeepers in a lot of ways. So treating them well, and I think having the right tech tools is all important. But wanted to obviously get your perspective on kind of the recruiter burnout and ways to help with that, Heidi.
Yeah, for sure. I think the first thing to say is that it is real. It's real that recruiter burnout is a real issue, I think, with companies that are growing, but we also have the great resignation that you hear about that's coming, where people held off for a long time and didn't leave jobs that they weren't satisfied with. And so we went through a transition this year. We doubled and almost tripled the size of our company over the past year. And I saw that burnout happen with our HR teams, where, we started trying to do things like, hey, today looks really like, or at the end of the week, we were pushing time off. Like, hey, why don't you guys just take a day on us and go, do the things that you need to do with your family. So we try to do some things internally, but that only goes so far, because they would come back and all of a sudden there's 3 more candidates they need to hire for, or we, have turnover in our engineering department. And all of a sudden that's a really difficult role to fill. And so I think one of the things that, and we're talking about tools here, but one of the things I think that makes a huge difference is hiring the right candidate the first time. And it's so hard when you are feeling desperate or, under the gun to get somebody in there. And I've done it both ways, where I've been a little bit more patient to wait for a good candidate. And while the pain is high there, it helps to have the right people to be able to not then have to replace them in 6 months because of poor performance or whatever. And so I think that's one of the really big ones is, they're using a tool to help with that. And my marketing background comes in here with finding the people that you want to clone. So who in your organization is a phenomenal fit for the job, and then going and looking at what they do, who they are, what you love about them, and understanding it's really like a buyer persona for a candidate. What is the candidate persona that you're trying to clone? Who is it that you really want to pattern this next hire after? If you can understand them, and maybe they all were baristas before, and all of a sudden it's like, hey, if we start seeing that on a resume, that's a really good, situation for us. So I think, hiring the right person the first time makes a huge difference in that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. And you have to go in knowing a little bit of what the type is for your particular company. And, I used to joke with an old boss of mine that, I said, if someone has lots of piercing, tattoos, and blue hair, they're a great person for Goodwill. but to kind of, not to, but, you have to kind of know, the things I'm looking for. We have a couple of unique challenges with nonprofits. At Goodwill, we're selling donated items. So it's a unique environment to begin with. And then being a nonprofit, salary is not competitive to a for-profit billion-dollar company. I can't compete with Walmart or Target.
Yeah.
So you have to compete with environment. And the people who tend to work out well at Goodwill tend to be people who have social concerns. They're people who tell me they love to thrift shop. Goodwill helped my family when I was younger because my parents had 5 kids. We were able to afford the clothes there. Someone tells me they're concerned about fashions that get thrown away that people buy. People who are artistic, people who, have a concern for social issues. Those things all tell me this might be a good fit with Goodwill. And then also, you have to know when, and I think addressing burnout, you have to make sure you realize that at the end of the day, people are people, and you can't personalize whether someone's not a fit or not, and it doesn't work out. Because sometimes I've had interviews that I thought, oh my God, this is the best candidate ever. And then they start and they walk out on the very first day. But I know that experience is shared with a variety of companies. So when I recruited externally, companies would hire people, and they had someone who walked out, said they were getting some lunch from the food truck, and she never came back. And so you never know why something's not a fit, but you have to be careful not to personalize that. And I think you have to know when, hey, it's clearly not a fit. And that's one of the things that's been helpful with Wedge and using it is we've sent about 1,200 wedges, 65% are done. I spend very little time on that 35% compared to what I used to.
Right.
They're not coming in person. I'm not waiting 2 or 3 days to see if a hiring manager likes them. So they're right off the radar, and I didn't spend any time with them because they really weren't interested. They just didn't want to tell me. So that helps. And, you have to know, and I've strongly encouraged people who, when I talk to, because we're a smaller retailer, we really need hours on the weekend. And I talk to a lot of people who are really hedge on it. And I say, hey, I don't want this to be a bad experience for you or for me. My job is to make sure that you're going to be happy with his job, and telling you the honest truth about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you really, really don't want to work weekends, we're not the fit for you. There
Right.
may be other jobs out there that are a better fit. So, that's part of my job, to present to the candidate a realistic. Our niche tends to be people, again, have some affinity for Goodwill. They like the nonprofit, the mission side of things, but also people who might have worked in fast food or
Mm-hmm.
are really good fits because they're used to a little more pace in their job. Because there's a little more uncertainty in our retail setting because you're dealing with donated items rather than, knowing what your product is on a day-to-day basis.
Right. And you know what? I think you bring up a tremendous point, Heidi, on your and understanding your workforce, I think is super important, and people that have worked before, and looking at kind of the diversity and inclusion side of things of that as well.
Mhm.
And Jack, to your point, obviously with Goodwill and nonprofits just quite generally, things like mission, value, they're not going there for the salary. Obviously, they're going to go there because, to your point, they have an affinity for Goodwill in some way, shape, or form. And obviously, things like culture are going to be important. How are you kind of conveying the mission and obviously helping through video and technologies like Applicant Pro will help with that, but how are you conveying that mission and kind of that culture throughout that hiring process? So obviously, ultimately, you are focusing on the right candidates, even beyond Wedge and Applicant Pro. Are there things that you let them know? Is there storytelling? Are there strategies that you do throughout? Because you'll know probably pretty fast if this person is really into that role or has that affinity for Goodwill that you're looking for.
Well, myself, I usually ask, pretty upfront when I talk to someone on the phone,
Yeah.
Why they applied to Goodwill. And that's usually when, based on their response, that kind of cues me to what I wish to, talk about. So if someone says, I'm interested in art and I buy a lot of things that at Goodwill that I repurpose, then that takes the conversation one direction. So
Right.
if someone talks about, I like thrift clothing, and I talk about how, the modern fashion industry is heavily influenced by thrift fashion and what people are thrifting.
Mhm.
So I think it just depends on what is a connection to that person. Some
Right.
people know that Goodwill provides services to people with disabilities. So you can expound a little more into that.
Right.
So a lot of times people will say, well, I'm 75 years old. Is that going to be a problem? And I say, well, I want you to know that, we have a truck driver who's 80 years old still. In fact, retirees are a big part of our, workforce here. People who have retired and said, I'm bored. I really want to come back. So, because I just can't fish anymore. So,
Mhm.
so I think you have to know whatever that connection is. Usually when I hear, well, I just saw it on Indeed and thought I'd apply, right there may not be as much of a connection there.
I love how you brought up there about figuring out what is important to them and then driving that through the interview. And I think that that's one of those things that you can carry forward even a little bit more. And one of the things we press really hard is the job ad, because the job ad is where you have a chance to tell the story. And I think that that's one of the coolest things about nonprofits is that you have a really distinct story to tell. And that's your differentiator. You're, like you said, you can't compete with other retailers and, cool benefits and, 100% time off or whatever they do that are deciding to do today. What did I see the other day? They pay weekly, right? There's all these different things that they do to try to attract people.
Yeah, some are paying daily now.
Yes, it's so true. It drops right into your bank account at the end of your shift. It's so crazy. But you look at that and it really isn't, if the differentiator of nonprofits has to do with the story that they tell, who you guys are, what purpose you're serving. And you've got this dual purpose in the thrifting. There's a very distinct cult following almost of thrifters. You can drive that story along with this story of mission and purpose. And I think that I know that there are some recruiters and nonprofit that feel kind of scummy, like driving that, like almost like a used car salesman. I don't feel like that is it at all. Like the story should be told. And it is something that very much differentiates you as a nonprofit. And so using that in your job ad, but then not being afraid to use it in your questions in your interview. And I think we've identified what our core values are, and we have an HR in our HR and our hiring manager are in most of our interviews, and HR is the one that really helps drive a lot of the questions around culture. And so we have a question about humble, and we want to know what, I think the question goes something like, tell me about someone who's better at something than you are that really matters to you, because we want them to tell us and see how they react to that question. And we've had people that are like, I can't really think of anything. But then there's other people that are like, oh, I've got so many. Let me tell you about my brother. He is incredible at this one thing. And what it does then is it opens up their ability to tell stories. And when we're telling stories back and forth, that's when true connection happens. And that's where you start to get more of this loyalty in your hiring. It's not just like, tell me about all your benefits, I'm going to check my boxes, but you can make this emotional connection that will drive you further into loyalty and retention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, because I think as a recruiter, you're also not trying to help the company. You're also, I would never feel talking about the mission and the company would be, icky or whatever, because, you want people to understand, because it's like anything else. You're also presenting information so that person knows, is this a fit for me?
Right.
Because you're really filling a dual purpose. I don't want anyone to come to work at Goodwill and be like, hey, that guy, didn't tell me this, or he didn't tell me that. And then sometimes you have to tell them the good and the bad, because when you're working with donated goods, it's just a different environment. The back of our store is not going to look like a Target or a Walmart. Things aren't in nice boxes and shrink wrap. It's going to look totally different. And I like to, some people think I'm trying to discourage them, but what I'm trying to do is giving them an honest appraisal. I've had people who are uncomfortable handling donated goods. Well,
they're going to struggle.
Right up front.
Yeah.
We're not for you. So you need to know that. And it's not a rejection, but it's rather just being honest. And I've always compared the job seeking process very much like dating.
Yeah.
You want to get to know the company, just like you don't, marry the person you just spoke to 5 minutes ago, who you don't know. You want to know a little bit about the job to see, do I really want to do this? You don't just hire someone, they walk in and, hey, here's what you're going to be doing today. There has to be an understanding, or else I'll never forget when I was young, one of the very first interviews I went on, because it was like, oh, it pays up to this amount of money and whatever. And I turned out it was selling Cutco knives. And, and I realized, well, this is probably going to be a pretty hard job. The ad sounded too good to be true, and they're really trying to pump you up. But that's a hard gig to sell knives door to door.
For sure. I love your perspective on fit, because I think it's so important. I think a lot of times we're trying to, drill them. We're asking all these questions, and it really is, let me tell you a little bit about who we are, and then you tell me about who you are, and we're going to see if there's mutual fit there, because that's really, I think, where you get, I don't know, that we talked about the revolving door of recruiting. If people are then coming in and then leaving, that's where you get the burnout, is over and over again. And, it's a hard gig for sure.
Yeah. And you have to be honest. I've had candidates be honest and thank me for being honest about the salary right up front, because they've told me that they've gone on interviews, or they've had an interview scheduled, and they get there and they realize, the salary is just totally way off. And I'm thinking, why would you want to waste your time bringing somebody in? And number one, it feels somewhat deceptive, but it's just a complete waste of your time. I mean,
Yeah.
if I
It is,
have,
but there's that noise of like, oh, look, I have all these interviews and
yes,
they're not good candidates. It doesn't matter. What you're focused on is results and not necessarily interviews.
yes.
Yeah.
Now, before we, when I took over the full recruiting process here, right after we opened after the being shut down from the pandemic, we had never posted our salaries before. The previous HR person was very reluctant. There are certain positions I will not, because there may be a range. But for the entry level jobs, everything from assistant manager on down, I post the salary. Our applications did go down, but I wasn't wasting my time talking to people who were like, oh, yeah, I can't do that.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I mean, you have to be upfront and honest, because it pays no good to make someone unhappy later, because that person may later see a job that is a fit at your organization. And you don't want them to have had a bad experience because they thought, well, I thought I was going to a warehouse job and here's entry level retail.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, level setting earlier on so they know what they're getting themselves into is going to be so crucial. And Jack, that story that you mentioned about one of your first roles selling knives, I went through the exact same thing, but it was because it was 15 an hour. That's all I saw. I was blinded by the salary. I was like, oh my God, at the time, that's the most I've ever made. And it turns out that I was actually eliminating bed bugs in some of the older buildings here in Toronto.
Okay.
And they didn't even let me know that in the job description. They
Wow.
just kind of danced around that. And when I showed up, there was one person already quitting. Suffice to say, I lasted about 48 hours. The working conditions weren't the best, but I think level setting and being transparent through a job ad, to your point, Heidi, before, and letting them know, hey, this is what it's going to be like, and being transparent and authentic throughout that beginning of the process, so you don't waste resources, so it doesn't lead to burnout. You're not spending time with the wrong candidates. And I think having those realistic job ads on the front end are going to be so crucial. And that kind of leads me to the last question in terms of new technologies and ways to level set earlier on in the process, or even when you reach out to them through sourcing or RPOs. Like, what are the technologies that you see, Heidi and Jack, that you think may transform and help that kind of transparency and authenticism, which is more important than ever? So you obviously going to be spending time with those people earlier on, because there's a lot of technologies out there. But I think, just to double click on what you had mentioned, Heidi, those realistic job ads and level setting there is going to be so important for recruiters, the process, and hiring that right candidate to reduce that turnover over time.
Yeah, for sure. I think Jack brought up the fact that we're seeing a lot of this all-in-one type of setting happening with, payroll combined with ATS, combined with HRAS type of systems. And what we see is that it's not all created equal, right? And so what you're getting sometimes is a trade-off where a lot of applicant tracking systems built into a full end-to-end system doesn't include any sourcing. And that's really what you start to miss. Then your candidate flow drops in, goes in the basement. And you're like, wait, what happened though? Because a lot of those things are not happening. So when you're evaluating systems, really looking at, especially as companies are tightening their belt with the economic situation that we're in right now, it's really trying to figure out, well, what are these actually the same? If not, they may look the same, but let's look at what is included in those things and being selective on the things that will not then harm you. Because sometimes there's like a hostile takeover where it's like, this is what we're doing and you have no say. But when you have a voice in that, really weighing what parts of this system is going to help or hurt. And I think the tighter the labor market gets, the worse the economy gets. Tools are going to be so critical in making sure that companies are able to recruit. And we talked a little bit earlier, very beginning of our chat, about having too many tools, and a lot of times people are peddling tools that don't provide the results. And so I think definitely we're seeing video interviewing on the forefront of getting this personal connection and getting people in the door and getting to people more rapidly than filling up your schedule. And then alongside a lot of these sourcing tools that are we're producing in order to keep costs low, where a lot of other companies are saying, well, you just need to sponsor on Indeed and sponsor. And that money necessarily it's not going to help you the same way, redefining a really good job ad is, because if you sponsor a bad job ad, it's not going to get you any results anyway. Right. And so technology can be so pivotal in burnout, like you said, and getting in front of the audience, casting your net wide to be able to get those candidates in the door. But be careful with what it is that you choose, because you want to make sure that it's going to get the results that you're looking for. And don't overly program it. If something's broken, find out where the hole is in the boat, rather than, bailing faster with more tech. It doesn't always solve the problem.
I agree. And one of the things, like I said, when we were looking to move to the new payroll system that would have an ATS, one of the things that made the ATS very difficult was it was visually hard to understand. And it was not visually easy and as a recruiter, and I've had people tell me that I had the most boring job at Goodwill because all I do is look at a computer screen and call people all day. And there is some truth to that to some degree. I enjoy it, but again, there are days you're like, oh wow, I've been on the computer a lot. So what you're looking at has to be visually easy. You should not have to like, okay, where's this at and where's that? But like one of the things people can get tricked in, like one of the things that the folks who weren't recruiting thought would be great. Well, you would be able to take someone's application information and transport it right into the payroll system. So it seems like, oh, that's going to make everything easier. But as I cautioned everybody, as I will be fully honest with you, I would say 70% of people's information, Indeed is our biggest source. 70% of people's information in there is outdated. And so you're going to think you're sending onboarding information to the right email. You have the right address and all that. But by and large, it's not going to be. And then you're just going to have to correct it. So it's really not necessarily as great of a thing as you think it is. And it's like, I'm surprised that in a lot of the, say public workforce systems and people still focus on resumes and things of that nature. And as someone who does hiring for more entry-level positions, I pay almost no attention to resume. Everything is really the interaction from the time I pick up the telephone. I do like to see some longevity on jobs. I'm not expecting a 20-year-old to have 10 years of experience, but I do like to see, you're somewhere a year. That's always very nice. But really the key thing is when I pick up the telephone, do you greet me in a polite and enthusiastic manner? And that's really what I'm looking for on Wedge is, do you come across friendly? I'm not expecting perfect answers for an entry-level job, but are you polite and friendly and do you try? And I think it's technology can't, because for what I'm doing, people are largely going to be working with people on a retail sales floor or working in the back. So this is not at home, not going to ever be at home, at least anytime soon. And so you still have to have that person-to-person contact.
Absolutely. And I think to your point, the world of just looking at the resume and looking kind of beyond that in terms of kind of open hiring. I will say handing out resumes when I was in school looking for a job at a local grocery store, I was wondering why I was the only one who wasn't getting a call back and not getting an interview is because I actually wrote my phone number wrong on the resume. So speaking of not looking at resumes, if someone hadn't looked at a resume there, maybe I actually would have gone a call back, or maybe my resume was just that bad. I don't know. But I do really appreciate the time, Heidi and Jack. That was kind of the last question. Really appreciate tuning into our second episode here at WedgeChatter. Thanks again, and we'll be in touch soon.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks,
you. Sean.
Have a wonderful day.
Take care.
Goodbye.